press
end of
record
this,
before I forget.
if by the end of this, not tonight, but the end of Lent, if I'm not on the wall, then I'm going to take personal offense. So even if I'm just up there for you to intercede for, like, my God, this guy needs prayer.
So
no problem.
Look, you got like collar on. Is that a cool tattoo I see there too?
Yep. A few of them. I mean, I don't know if you think they're cool, but there are a few of tattoos.
He's got the cool background. He's got the cool shirt. He's got the cool tattoos. He's like, I'm an expert on Robert Jensen. Like,
and
it's like my ideal self from an alternate universe is like sitting in front of me.
Oh, wow.
This is like a spiritual discipline. I'm just going to spend time with you for Lent to work on my own ego.
Snap into the spice.
Mm. How are you guys connected, Josh, Jason?
Josh, go ahead.
No, I just we're both Methodist pastors. Met through we're in the same conference. We're both in Virginia.
That was about the limpest answer.
Like, there's no warmth, no affection.
Well, yeah, we work for the same company.
We're creatures of the living God, and that's really our only connection.
Well,
but here's Todd.
How it is.
And Todd is amazing.
Hey, Todd.
In the chat.
Do you guys know each other? Is that an Oklahoma thing?
Nope.
Oh, all right. Here, Todd, make Oklahoma nice here as we prepare.
Chris, were you at ORU?
I was, yeah. So I did the doctorate of ministry there before I did the PhD, and then I taught at ORU for almost 4 years.
Would you have been there early 2000s?
No, so I graduated the DMin in 2008, I think. So I would have just been a little later.
I met a professor or two there. Do you know Mark Riddle by chance?
I do. Yeah. Not well, but I know him.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
We might have met with Mark Riddle a long time ago.
Oh, wow.
Possibly at a coffee shop. He invited you to an event, maybe.
Oh, well, tell me more about the event.
I'm trying to find my stat volume.
Hey, Father Ken. How are you? Oh, you can't hear us very well.
Can hear everyone. I can't hear Todd very well. But
That's not your fault. That's Todd's fault.
no, everybody else sounds good.
Can you hear me, Ken?
I can.
Chris might be sucking up all the bandwidth in Oklahoma. And
the Josh Monica Heisen do you have yourself on original sound for musicians and all that?
Does it sound like it?
I don't know. It's a setting that apparently is supposed to be helpful when you're playing music. But
Yeah, no, I'm wondering if you guys don't hear any effect in the microphone.
no, just pure rich testosterone.
So I've got something wrong. But you can hear me, so that's right.
So folks are still coming in. So
they're already asking for a song, Josh.
Well, I've got one in pocket.
Your fans, as many as Ringo Starr.
Does that sound better?
yes, Todd.
Okay, thank you. Where's the tear?
I think he is having dinner with his father-in-law.
Oh,
So
sounds ominous.
yeah, Ash Wednesday starts early for Tier.
Yeah. Well, hello all. Nice to see you again.
So we will get started here in just a minute. It looks like people are still coming in. We've got like 250 people signed up.
Wow.
For this. So yeah, so a lot of people have already emailed me. Yes, we will make the recordings available afterwards for people who can't join us on in person online Monday nights. And my goal is to say as little as possible and let Chris speak as much as possible.
Especially in light of the sermon we read.
And so we're going to get started here. So what I would like to do first, Chris, we've been doing these like Monday night sessions with different people, like Brian Zahn most recently.
cool. Yeah.
And at some point along the way, we just got into the habit of Josh starting us off not with a prayer spoken, but with a song. So Josh is going to open us with a little musical piece. And then I have asked Ken to get us started tonight by not reading his foreword, but kind of distilling it for folks who may not have read it yet. And then after that, I'm going to disappear and I will just moderate questions. And so I'm going to let Josh and Todd and Tony first ask their questions, and then I will moderate questions from the group. So Josh.
Well, without giving too much away, I will quote Chris up top in saying that Chris said that we are most human, not when we speak everything that's on our mind, but when we listen most intimately. So that's where this is coming from. It's amazing how you can speak right to my heart. Without saying a word, you can light up the dark. Try as I may, I could never explain what I hear when you don't say a thing. The smile on your face lets me know that you need me. There's a truth in your eyes saying you'll never leave me. A touch of your hand says you catch me ever I fall. You say it best when you say nothing at all. Day long I can hear people talking out loud. But when you hold me near, you drown out the crowd. Oh, Mr. Webster could never define what's being said between your heart and mine. The smile on your face lets me know that you need me. There's a truth in your eyes saying you'll never leave me. A touch of your hand says you catch me ever I fall. You say it best when you say nothing at all. The smile on your face lets me know that you need me. There's a truth in your eyes saying you'll never leave me. A touch of your hand says you catch me ever I fall. You say it best when you say nothing at all.
Thank you, Josh. Gosh, I had that Alison Krauss album on like repeat in the early 2000s. So Ken, for folks who may not know who you are, introduce yourself and explain why you have written a foreword to Chris's book. Like, why would he allow you to do that? And tell us, why you commended it to people.
Sure. Ken Tanner. I'm a priest in Michigan, near Detroit. Long time early fan of Crackers and Grape Juice. I think there's a podcast that says Our Greatest Fan or something like that. Long time listener. Those are my greatest claims to fame. So Jason, Tier, Taylor, and all these people. Todd. So Chris and I have known each other online for about a decade. I think we got introduced because the students started reading me and were passing things to him and saying, hey, you need to read this. And then we got connected that way. And then we met for the first time in New York, I think, 6 years ago or something. He and Julie. And we just have become very close, and we love each other and love what we're thinking and feeling and hoping about Jesus. So we like to talk through that a lot, figure out soundboard. Does this sound right to you? But no, this is the second or third book of Chris's that I've read, and kind of as he was making them, and offered my my comments, and it usually just stunned with what he's doing. But the deal with Chris is, he saw Jesus and didn't live to tell about it. So the sermons in this book are dispatches from the grave. My friend trusts that God is dead, really dead, and reminds those who have gotten behind Christ, those who follow him on the road to Golgotha, that by our baptism we join Jesus in his death. If you've seen, some of our listeners might have seen Hans Holbein's Dead Christ. If you look at it long enough, there's something that takes hold of you. It's not just sorrow, there's hope. And what happens is, if you remain with Jesus in his death long enough, as Chris has, you begin to understand that stillness and weakness are the conditions from which God makes all things new. Divine helplessness is greater than any power in the cosmos. And his death is at work in us and in the creation, like leaven and bread. And the leaven turns out to be resurrection. So here, where we all exist in the tomb of our shattered existence, dwelling among us, the human God has made his bed in hell. And Jesus invites us to trust his wound and his death, because the gospel is not first the news that we can receive Jesus into our lives. The gospel is first and foremost that Jesus has received us into his death. All things must pass from death to life through his person, the one in whom nothing divine is absent, nothing human lacking. So, if you've got this book, I encourage you to read it slowly. Chris has arranged it so you can read it in 40 installments over Lent, or you can just read it however you want, but read it slowly, like you have the kind of time someone whose life is buried with Jesus has. And as you read, you will find that God is at work in you. You will feel in your bones this wisdom from one of the first Christians. What does it profit me to say that Christ has come to earth only in the flesh he received from Mary, if I do not show that he has also come in my flesh? And the showing of Jesus in our flesh is not something for which we struggle. It is a grace, all of it a gift. For Christ is forever by the Spirit, flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone, and we are crucified with him and are committed with Jesus into the Father's hands. When we encounter Jesus Christ, we don't live to tell about it. We die with him. And then we preach the sort of stories that follow. So, you know, that's Chris, and that's this book, and I'm just glad to be along for the ride. Transfiguration is something that he and I talk quite a lot about, and so I'm glad that for the next 7 weeks we get to hear some more from him about it.
Thank you, Ken.
You're welcome.
So folks, Ken Tanner, that's proof he not only looks like Gandalf, he can speak as wisely as Gandalf.
And
So-
what congregation or what type of congregation are you a priest at?
Holy Redeemer, we're this paradox called charismatic Episcopalians. Or as Jason once said
insert
to me,
joke there.
I think Jason once said Anglican adjacent.
I when you grow up I didn't even grow up Christian, so I don't never mind. I'm just gonna stop talking. So Chris, first introduce yourself to people here and listeners later.
Yeah.
And then just dive in and talk to us about what it might mean to have perfect clarity around this idea of listening to the one who is the word.
Yeah. So I'm Chris. I'm professor of public theology at Southeastern in Lakeland, Florida, it's a liberal arts university. We have about 10,000 students. I teach grad students in the seminary, doctoral students. I teach a preaching class in our doctoral program. I'm also a priest in Anglican adjacent charismatic communion, not the same one, but just one branch down on that tree from Father Kenneth, and have served as teaching pastor and assistant priest for the last 10 plus years at Sanctuary in Tulsa, where my wife and I live with our two youngest. Our oldest is now at Syracuse in New York. She's a freshman there at college. And that's probably enough of an introduction. I'm happy to say more, but I mean, that's at least a start. As Father Kenneth said, I mean, we met online a few years before we met in person. And then since then, I think the friendship has just continued to build. And now we talk pretty much every day, I think. He has to tell me I've got to step away for a while, or I'll just keep inundating him with texts. The question about listening, this struck me yesterday when I was getting ready to preach the Transfiguration text again, that I'd kind of always assumed that it was the radiation of Jesus' light that overwhelmed the disciples, Peter, James, and John. But in Matthew's telling, that isn't it. They're not overwhelmed by what they see. They're overwhelmed when they hear the voice. They don't fall on their faces until the voice speaks. The cloud descends, the voice speaks, then they fall. And what the voice says, of course, is, "This is my son, the beloved, and you should listen to him." Right? And what struck me yesterday, and Father Ken and I talked about this, is once that's said, the first thing Jesus does is not say anything at all, but touch them. Right? So they're laid out, and Christian iconography, I think, often does a good job of showing the ways in which the disciples are kind of laid out by this encounter of what they've seen and heard, and the awe of it, the mystery of it. But Jesus comes to each of them and touches them, and that touch, I think, enables hearing. And then what he says is, "Stand up, do not be afraid." And I think there are two things to name there, which I mentioned in the sermon yesterday. One is, he didn't want them groveling. They're overwhelmed by the glory. The weight of it pushes them down. But immediately the glorious one pulls them up, like, stand up, face me, and don't be afraid. And I think where listening begins is being able to hear him engage us face to face with a word of a reassurance. You don't need to be afraid. I want to stand face to face with you, friend to friend, spouse to spouse, brother to brother, flesh of flesh and bone of bone. I want to stand face to face with you, and I want you not to be afraid. And once we hear that, we can hear everything else. But until we've heard that, we can't hear anything else. And I think this is, I mean, I've been to enough therapy sessions in my life to know that if you're genuinely afraid, your brain doesn't work rightly, right? You cannot process what's being said if you're afraid. And I think that's why Jesus starts with, don't be afraid. I have a lot to say to you that's going to start once we start down this mountain. But most importantly, you gotta be able to hear me. And to hear me, you have to know you don't have anything to fear in what I'm going to say to you. And so it begins. And I think that's where the touch of Jesus frees us up to listen.
Tony, I'm going to let you have the first question, thought.
Okay. Good to meet you, Chris, and see you
Good to meet
again,
you, Tony.
Ken. And yeah, and certainly Josh and Todd and Jason. I'm a mostly retired pastor writer in Seattle, Washington. Currently work with students at Vancouver School of Theology.
You wrote a great commentary on the book of Acts, Chris, just for your notes.
Yes, I have a PhD student who's about to start on Acts.
Oh,
So
really?
thank you for that. Yeah.
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah. Good. Great. Wrote a good commentary too on 1 and 2 Timothy, but nobody wants to read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was a wonderful sermon. Thank you for it. I want to call attention to a bit on page 18, the end of I guess about the middle of the page, where you write, we want God to improve our standing without turning our world entirely upside down. We want change, and to be changed, we do not want to die. And that is why we need to move from Epiphany into Lent. I guess I just want you to say a bit more about that. I love the phrase, we'd like God to improve our standing. We sure would. But don't rearrange our world. It reminds me, I did some consulting. The saw among consultants is a congregation or leaders will say to you, fix everything but change nothing. Which is a bit of a challenge. So when you say we do not want to die, say more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, because it's easy sometimes to use those phrases that are taken right out of Scripture without considering, what they're actually requiring of us. I think maybe a place to start there is how Ross has influenced me here on this point, that American Christianity is, by and large, in its dominant forms, it's a Christianity that we use to improve our lives. We draw on it in as much, again, speaking very broadly here, but we tend to think of church and the gospel and God, the God of the gospel, as good insofar as it's useful, and useful for the bettering of our lives, the giving us better standing. Right. I grew up, and I still move. I mean, I live in Tulsa, which is like the mecca of the word of faith, health and wealth gospel. And of course, the distortion of that preaching is that God will improve your economic standing, right? Your status, the house, the zip code you live in, the car you drive, and so on, your bank accounts. But it could be any version, right? I mean, the church I attended as a kid that my parents took me to was this rural, working class, blue collar Pentecostal church, where they were as far from health and wealth gospel as you can get, right? But there still was a pull toward, how does God help better our lives? And I think what the gospel actually promises us is something so much better than that, but it comes by altering us and our worlds completely. Like that it is a total renovation and reworking. And so I hope that in the chapter there is this sense of Jesus wants to, as I said just a moment ago, he wants it to end with us standing. But that can't happen until we've come undone. And so dying, I think, names coming to the end of ourselves in every way. The end of the world as we know it, the end of ministry as we know it, the end of identity as we know it. Like this is, what old school Methodist holiness people talked about, putting it all on the altar. Like that sense of being a whole sacrifice. And that I'm convinced that is what we're all called to, is that kind of having our lives completely claimed by God and letting him set the agenda for us about everything in life, right? And not picking and choosing what he has said and done we find useful. It's an all or nothing proposition, I think. And the all comes on the other side of the nothing. like we have to be brought down to the nothing in order to come back as where God is all in all.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful and moving. Yeah, I guess you could look at the Matthew Transfiguration story then and say the being driven to the ground is kind of a dying.
Yes.
And
yeah,
he comes to them.
Yes.
The agency there is his. He's the subject of the verb, as Fleming likes to say.
Mm-hmm.
And not, well, most of the sermons I've heard on that text and most of my preach probably are about, we need to not tarry on the mountain, but go down to the valley. And I've always kind of wondered if we've ever been to the mountaintop, but
yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't, I think that what's interesting is when you put that story alongside the story of Moses on the mountain, Moses expressly told to tarry.
Mm-hmm.
You must wait these 6 days. And in a sense, Moses has already waited 80 years for this. And now he gets 6 more days of waiting. And then he's taken up for 40 days. And the disciples have to wait 6 days between Jesus making the announcement, some of you will not die before you see the kingdom come. And then Peter, James, and John being led up. But I think there's a way in which the suddenness of this does force on them a kind of death. In fact, I'm far from the first person to point out that in Matthew, you've got 3 mountains, really. You've got the Mount of Beatitudes, the Mount of Transfiguration, and then, of course, the Mount of the Crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the moment, one way of reading that is on the Mount of the Beatitudes, Jesus announces, this is what it's going to mean to follow me. You're going to die. Blessed are those who are persecuted, as the prophets. They killed the prophets who were before you, right? That's what's going to happen to you when you live the life I've called you to live. And then in the middle mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration, they experience it. Like they're driven to their faces and then called to their feet with his touch. And then on Golgotha, he enacts that in a way that includes us, right? So mystically, we're included in what happens in Golgotha. But I think all 3 of the message on all 3 of those mountains is the same. Like the only way to life is death. The only way to follow me is to lose everything in trusting it to me, giving it over to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I feel I'm blessed to have come from holiness stock, where that preaching, even though there were ways in which it got distorted at times, that core sense of you are called to the altar. You are called to meet God at the altar. Like that somehow stuck with me. And I think it's true. I think it holds true for all of us.
At the altar being where you surrender.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where you surrender all, where you're saying it's yours, God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that includes like what our dreams are about what should happen with our lives, what should happen with the lives of other people, our ambitions, our wishes, and both the things that need to be. There's an early Pentecostal, he was a Methodist pastor who spoke in tongues and got forced out of his conference and ended up becoming a Pentecostal bishop. J.H. King was his name. And he had this sermon he preached, and I swear he must have read St. John of the Cross. He doesn't quote St. John, but it reads like it's right out of that Carmelite tradition. But King, and he preached this sermon in a lot of different places, but he says that every Christian is called to make two sacrifices, as Abraham was. You must give up Ishmael, which is that which is in your life that should never have been in your life. It's only in your life because you stepped away from the will of God. But that is not where the cross is felt most deeply. He says true consecration is when you're ready to give up Isaac, which is the thing that's in your life because you've followed God's will. The good thing that you have to be ready to let go of, take your hands off of. And like that line, it seems to me to be right? That consecration, sanctification is not just the working out of impurities and wickednesses. It's also taking our best instincts, our better angels, and putting that on the altar, our highest ideals, and putting that on the altar, and recognizing that the consuming fire has to consume everything that can be consumed. And I think for whatever reason, that's the message I inherited that has stayed with me, with all the things that have changed. I mean, a lot of the people I grew up with would not claim me now as not only as a fellow Pentecostal, but as a fellow Christian. But
Really?
oh yeah, I mean, they were radical Pentecostal folks, but I stand by that. I think that word is true, right? God is all or nothing God.
Well, I could bring up the Asbury revival based on what you've been saying, but that would maybe lead us down a rabbit hole we don't want to go right now. But
I assume it will come up at some point.
Yeah. Anyhow, thank you,
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, this is great, Chris. I mean, this is you listening to you makes me wish I had a marketable skill, so I could just have you be my priest and I would do something else. So I don't have any of those. So Todd, you've tried to jump in a couple of times here, so go ahead. Okie dokie, go for it.
Okie dokie. Chris, I have been exposed to a lot of people I would have never read, meeting my Methodist brothers here, and then Ken on his own. So here we are, and a couple of figures that they've introduced have remarked that God is a talkative God. In fact, I had just been introduced to Robert Jensen and read his little book, and he said God talks too much. and then I think it's Will Willimon that Jason often quotes that God is a loquacious God.
Yeah.
And yet you make this remark, for God, of course, both silence and speech are word. So maybe you could kind of open up that a little bit more as to kind of how we receive word in silence, kind of maybe tease that out a little bit more, given the fact that everybody on this screen is just accustomed to talking all the time.
Right. Well, man, so much, Todd. Thanks for that question. I just remembered, by the way, the event that you were talking about while you were talking. So yes, we did in fact run into each other years ago. But I would say one way into that conversation is to look at the way the Gospels tell the story of Jesus, right? And the fact that we get, the vast majority of his life is hidden from us. We call it the silent years, right? Those years in which he's not doing anything that we know of, right? That we have access to. And that is a word in itself, right? That it's a reminder to us that those things that are done in secret, those things that have no value to ministry, matter to God. Like they matter to God so much that he lived it, right? That he comes and lives a life that is overwhelmingly spent in obscurity, right? In a tiny provincial part of the world, a backwater of the world, and that he comes to live that life and to live that life abundantly, the life of a carpenter, the life of a fisherman, the life of a small village. And that, again, that speaks, that silence speaks. I think too, once we get to the story of his ministry, there are moments in which he doesn't say anything. Think about what happens, right, with the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery.
Mhm.
Right? His silence is speaking. His silence is carrying weight. And when he finally does speak, of course, that it's enacting the holiness that's already working in the silence. Or when he's standing before Herod. I mean, one of the things that I'm so impressed by is the ways in which Jesus just doesn't really give a damn about powerful people. Like he's not trying to say the right thing to them. He's not careful with his P's and Q's, right? Like he smarts off. I mean, really the only time we see Jesus truly being a smart aleck is when he's talking about Herod, right? You go and tell that fox, I've got work to do, right? And I'm going to finish it. And then when he's in with Herod, doesn't say a word, like won't speak. That says a lot, right? There's a heaviness to his refusal to dignify Herod's mockery with a response. And so I think you see those ways. Jensen makes a lot of the fact that God talks. And of course, there's a whole line of Christian thought, probably most emphatic in the mystics, but it runs all the way through Christian theology. I mean, you can see it in the Cappadocian Fathers, right? That silence is what we're moving toward, that silence is somehow greater than speech. Even someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right, will say, unless our words come from silence, they're not trustworthy. Like our word has to arise from silence. And so I'm drawing on that as well, right? That sense of we have to learn how not to speak. Go back to the Transfiguration story for a moment. So listen to him, listen to the Son. Then what the Son says is stand up, don't be afraid. And then there's silence. And as they're walking down the mountain, what does Jesus do? Tell them to be quiet. Do not mention what you've seen and heard here until after I've been resurrected. And we know from what the gospel tells us, they don't know what that means. What do you mean resurrected? Like, what are you talking about? Still, they don't know. And yet they're commanded to silence. So I wanted to try to emphasize in a way in which, yes, God is always communicating, but there are times in our lives in which what God is not saying has weight, right? And in my tribe, and Todd, I know you know what I'm talking about here. In my tribe, there's so much emphasis on what is God saying to you.
Mm-hmm.
Words of prophecy, words that come in your devotion time, a sense of what the Spirit is saying, whispering to you in your heart. And there's a way in which we lose touch with, sometimes God isn't saying anything because the silence is what we need. One more biblical story to kind of get at that. The story of Zacharias, when the angel appears to him and says, your wife is going to have a son, right? And he's like, oh yeah, really? Well, how will I know? How do I know this is going to happen? And the angel takes his voice from him, silences him. And this, to me, what's important is that this is not a punishment. It's the gift of silence. I'm going to gift you silence so that when your son, who's going to be the voice crying in the wilderness, is born, you'll be able to hear it. Like right now, you can't hear. Like your ears are dull, or as the King James will say, your ears are heavy. And you need the gift of silence so that when the voice speaks, you can hear. So that Todd is what I'm trying to get at there, right? That those of us who are pietistic spiritualists in the we believe in a living God who's lively and loquacious, right? Amen to all that.
Right.
But sometimes the way he communicates to us is to let us sit in the stillness, right? To be still so we can know. And rather than resisting that as, well, I've done something wrong that's aggrieved God, right? We can just rest in it. We can rest in the not hearing and recognize that with God, every silence is pregnant.
Oh, thank you. I think that's very good. I wondered if someone might, from a different tradition, happen along that particular section and be helped by a little bit more flowering of that thought.
Yeah, that's right. And there's one more illustration of that. So one of my mentors is a man named Ricky Moore, who was taught he just retired. He taught Old Testament at Lee, which is one of the universities that is experiencing revival right now. And Ricky's actually involved at Asbury as well. So Ricky is, I mean, he will hate that I drew his attention to him, but one of the things that Ricky told me years ago is he had a stretch, a few months in which he had he didn't use these words, but what I would describe as this kind of unbroken mystical experience, like that lasted for months, and a sense of just being in the presence, the consuming presence of God night and day. And then one day it stopped. It was just over. And it went for years like that, without having that sense of nearness, that sense of intimacy. And he was talking with one of his friends at his house one day and was in tears. And he said, you know, I'm not sure how to put this, but I think I'm lonely. Like that experience, that intensity, like there was a charge to it that made me feel close to God. And I liked that, as demanding as it was. And now I wonder, like, if I'd done something to estrange myself from God or to turn God away. And his friend just pointed to Ricky's granddaughter, who was across the room playing with Legos. And he said, Ricky, look how satisfied she is. You don't have to be in her face, and she doesn't have to be in yours to be at home. And you need to know that God doesn't need you in his face, and you don't have to have God in your face all the time to be at home. And I think something like that too is what I'm after, right? That sense of don't be anxious, right? If you're not every day hearing some thunderous word from God, that doesn't mean something is wrong with you, right? Like that stillness and quietness can be rest. And we should be able to be at peace with that too. So I don't know if that muddies the waters or helps to flower it.
That's good.
It's a great
That's
question.
good.
So
That's
it's so it's come up a couple of times now. So maybe this is a good place. The Asbury Awakening.
Yeah.
I don't know. So we've got 250 folks. Like I don't know how many of them are aware of this if they're not actively online all the time. So Chris, can you talk about and just for the United Methodists here, Asbury is a United Methodist institution. Several of my friends have graduated from there. Can you kind of just, in a nutshell, what's going on there, and give people kind of a, your I don't know, just talk about it real quick.
Sure. I mean, I'll in terms of what's going on there, I'll defer to the folks who are actually there. I'm good friends with Jason Vickers, who's on faculty there. Jason has written about it. So if you just jump on Facebook, look up Jason Vickers. Jason today, I think, or yesterday, made a post linking to other faculty at Asbury, faculty and staff at Asbury, the university and the seminary, who've been a part, including Craig Keener, who's another friend, and Ben Witherington, folks like that are giving kind of firsthand accounts of what's actually happening there. I would say, and of course, this is, as I mentioned already, it's also happening at other places, at Lee that I mentioned a moment ago. And I think Samford is another place that's been named recently. Just a couple of quick thoughts, and then you can, if it's not enough, kick it right back at me. But first of all, I think we have to distinguish between revival and revivalism. I think revival is a grace revivalism is a disease, but the disease does not make the grace unreal. I mean, what's so bad about the disease is precisely the goodness of the revival.
Yeah, that's really good, because like fundamentals are a good idea.
Fundamentalism, not a good idea.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's really
And
good. Yeah.
in that way, I think it's like cancer, right? Like my liver is good, but cancer cells in my liver are not good. Precisely.
The Bible's good.
The
Biblicism,
Bible is good.
not so good.
Yes. And so on down the line, right? And of course, I'm just drawing there on that wonderful line from Pelican, like tradition is the living faith of the dead, traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Like that, I think revivalism is devastatingly destructive. But we should despise revivalism precisely because we cherish the reality we're naming as revival. And of course, it can be named in lots of different ways. The language of revival is new, historically speaking, but the work of the Spirit is not new. Times of refreshing, awakenings, those things are not new. And we have to be careful here not to let our reaction to the terms like revival. I know some people, they hear that word and they salivate, and other people hear that word and they recoil. But you got to get past what the word does to you. I mean, wherever people are present to God and God is present to them, good is happening, right? And I should point out too, I think, again, the folks who raised me, they wouldn't have said it like this, but they essentially believed in a God who didn't do very much. We were always asking him to do something because we were convinced if we didn't beg him, he wasn't actually going to act. Right? So we were like, God, please act. I don't, of course, believe that. I think God is always acting. But we can be present to that action in ways that are renewing. It's not an accident that these revivals often break out in places where people give themselves to hours of prolonged prayer. Like, what would happen to us if we just did that? Like if we just took days at a time for study and prayer and praise, I am certain like God would meet us there. So in some ways, I don't know that I have a lot to say about revival other than it's good to be present with God. Back to Tony's point, sometimes you do need to stay on the mountain, at least for a little while. Like you might not want to build a temple there, but it wouldn't hurt to spend a few minutes, right? To dwell in that presence. So I think that was what I would say about revival. What grieves me is the kind of ceaseless punditry about it.
Yes.
And I say grieves me, that sounds holiness. What really ticks me off, like infuriates me, is people feeling the need and or the right to weigh in on all this stuff, right? And I don't quite know what to do in the face of all that. Like, I think there's a way in which sometimes we just shouldn't say anything. Sometimes you have to speak up, though. And it reminds me, I've mentioned him a few times, but it reminds me of something Bonhoeffer says about stupidity. This is an essay that he writes in prison toward the end of his life, in which he says, stupidity is a far greater danger to us than malice is. And I think a lot of punditry is well-intentioned, but it's just stupid. It doesn't illuminate anything. It just obscures or triggers or offends or estranges. And unfortunately, I think that's what revival is going to mean in a social media age. Like any good thing that happens, the moment it hits the interwebs, now it's fodder for punditry. And at that point, it's not just the people. I mean, you've got the snake oil salesman, of course. I mean, American Christianity thrives on it produces these kinds of people where you've got people who are seizing on this for their own sake, right? They're building a brand and they're going to take Asbury or any other revival and try to use it to build their brand. But I'm not talking about those people. Like they'll answer to God for that. I'm talking about people who are really well-intentioned, but just don't know how to let God work in other people's lives without having an opinion about it. And I think that there's a great grace in realizing I don't have to have an opinion about everything God is doing with you. Like, not only do I not have to say it, I don't even have to have a thought about it. I love that exchange at the end of the Gospel of John, where Jesus is talking to Peter, and he says, what is it to you if I will for him to live forever? And the gospel gives us this little detail about, this is how the rumor was started that the beloved disciple would never die, because people are stupid in the Bonhoeffer sense. They're stupefied by the cares of life, and they can't keep from sharing their opinions. And it's such a grace to realize I don't have to have an opinion, right? Like it's really not mine to deal with. And so, I don't know if that's enough or too much, but that's where I would start, Jason.
I think that's helpful. So if folks just Google Asbury, Asbury, awakening or revival, they'll find some stories.
Yeah.
It like Josh, Todd, Ken, and I were on a message thread about this, and what I do think is illuminating is how long it took for me to know about this based on the algorithms of my social media accounts. So that's problematic. B, how easily this story of these young people's charismatic experience, how quickly it gets enveloped in the red versus blue,
oh my gosh, yeah,
partisan battles. So
Yep.
so that makes you wonder, like, well, what other topics in my life are siloed into these categories? And then C,
narrator, all of them. That's how many.
and then C, I think there is a knee-jerk reaction to deconstruct what has happened, what is going on, and to project ulterior motives onto it that I think betrays a certain kind of functional atheism among mainline Christians. That I think really that we and it connects to your book, like that we are to listen and be silent, and like it requires a God who speaks. And I think there's a whole lot of people who identify as Christians who don't think that God does that anymore.
Right. God speaking is a metaphor for something else.
Yes. And then D, it shows how we all really like the law and not the gospel, because a lot of people are reacting against this is like, well, this can't be happening with those people. So it's like, something else has to be going on, because God could not be blessing these people in a particular way.
One of the reasons I think this
spoken like a good Lutheran, Jason.
One of the reasons I think this conversation is so fruitful, Jason, for us to have, is that I'm not from the mainline world. I wasn't raised in it. I don't move in it now, right? And so the people I'm around mostly are of two kinds. People who are like rabid for anything revival, right? Just willing to buy anything that feels exhilarating in any way, and people who are wounded by that and are reacting against it, right? So I would say the people that I'm actually pastoring, my friends that I talk to on a daily basis, the people I'm preaching to and teaching the students in my classroom, are in one of those two places. It's not that they don't believe in a God who acts and speaks. It's either they can't distinguish any thought that comes into their head from the voice of God, right? Because they've been so anything that surprises them feels divine, right? Because we've been so pressured to hear from God and to live this life from miracle to miracle and grace to grace and victory to victory. Or, and this number of course is growing exponentially every day, people who are burned out and broken by that.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people that I care for. So this is it, but it's a different conversation when people don't even believe that there is a God to do any speaking and acting, right? So I think superstition and idolatry is the temptation in my part of the world, and then just despair in the face of it all. Whereas I think what you're describing there is just a kind of functional atheism, like in which God is a metaphor for something else, right? And
or to say it straight, God, whatever God might be saying is part of a political agenda of this group or that group.
Yeah. And that's a good, Chris. It's like you and I, like we get at Robert Jensen from two different angles. That I think one of the things that Robert Jensen does bravely is just name the dark nihilism that is the functional atheism of us of much of Western secularly accommodated Christianity.
Yeah.
That there's a reason why our young people are not healthy. Like it's, I mean,
Yeah.
like how many Atlantic stories do you have to read before you realize, well, it's because they don't, like, this is all there is.
Mhm.
That's what you're telling them.
Right.
So, but I promise not to talk.
Well, and look, just say one more thing about that, Jason. I think, and this is, a generalization, maybe or even a caricature, but I think there are places in which God is just a metaphor for my ideal of justice.
Yeah.
And then there are places in which God is just a name for whatever it is that makes my life what I want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever force it is that makes my life what I want it to be. And the job of ministers, of priests and pastors, is to say, no, God is the one revealed in the life and story in the face of this man, Jesus, Mary's son and Pilate's victim. Like, that's what, to me, that's what, where you and I meet reading Jensen, is that Jensen is insisting on, you must identify God in this man.
Yep.
And this life and this story and these texts. And that cuts, whether you're talking about God as a metaphor for justice or you're talking about God as the force that delivers the life you want. And I mean, that's, I think, why Jensen's work is as prophetic as it is.
Let me
Yeah.
jump in there,
Well,
Chris.
hold on, Josh. I had a really good introduction for you. But just to reply to Chris there, it's Jensen is famed. So Robert Jensen, America's greatest theologian, according to Stanley Hauerwas. He's famed, so he's well known among people like us for saying that God is whoever raised Jesus from the dead, having first raised Israel from slavery in Egypt. And what's really important about that quote is the whoever, because it names that, like, well, we don't automatically know who God is apart from God's particular activity in history.
Yep.
So yeah. So not only does Josh have a great singing voice, Chris, of all the people here on the panel, I knew prior to all of this that Josh is your number one fan. And so I'm counting on the fact that Josh has been listening attentively and has a good thought. So Josh.
Chris, where you were just talking about that dichotomy between God is whoever, my sense of justice, or the life that I want. God's going to empower me and God's going to be my genie in the bottle, right?
Yep.
One of the things you highlight in this first sermon, or let me preface this with saying this group of friends, you will hear people lift up Luther's quote that God can handle your sin, right? God doesn't need your good deeds, but your neighbor does, right? And one of the things you lift up in this sermon is that we need to be quiet long enough to see that God is tabernacling in our neighbor. And when we are invited on the mountain to follow Jesus in his death, not only do we lay down our own things on the altar, but we die in service to our neighbor.
Yes.
Right. One of the things that we, with this Asbury thing and with any other thing we could name, the red, blue politics, all that stuff, is all the finger wagging and the moralism, where we're trying to tell the world the way they should be because they need to get right with God, instead of seeing Christ in our neighbor. So I wonder if you could elucidate on that part of your chapter.
Yeah. So I became convinced years ago that holiness just is intercession. That when we often think about holiness as that which separates, like makes a distinction, sets apart, right? But if you read scripture, the set apartness is always for the sake of intercession. Like, so Israel is set apart from the nations for the sake of the world. So the set apartness is a means to an end. The end is the unification of all flooding into the house of God, right? All the nations coming to Zion. And I think holiness is the way in which God is with us without violating us, right? The language of Scripture again, God is the Holy One in your midst. We often frame this as if God's holiness is what makes it so that God can't be with us. God can't look on our sin and so on. No, God's holiness is how God is with us. God's holiness is how God is with us in such a way that it's a healing presence, a sanctifying one, and one that alters us toward wholeness, that brings us to death so that we can know life as he lives it. And I think all of that is embodied, of course, in what God himself does, right? That Philippians 2, Jesus is in the form of God. He is, in the language of John 1, he's in the Father's embrace. And he turns from that to us to make room inside of that intimacy he has with the Father for us. So that he does not want to have the Father all to himself. The Father does not want to have the Son all to himself. Somewhere, I can't remember where, but I drew this distinction between Rublev's icon of the Trinity, where the Trinity are seated at the table, but there's room at the table for us to come near. And think about how that is different from sculptures or paintings of lovers who are kissing face to face, in which we cannot get access, right? God does not relate to God in a way that edges us out. God relates to God in a way that draws us in. So to be like God is to always be the kind of person who's not edging out, but drawing in, right? That, by definition, that's what it means to be godly. And it's why when you look at Moses or Paul, you look at any of the apostles who, or the prophets, their lives are lives poured out for the sake of those who are against them. And it, in the language of John Wesley, it's acts of mercy, right? Where you're enacting God's mercy on those who are in need. But I think we should add to that, it's also at its heart, it's priestly. It's this sense in which my life exists for the sake of opening up the conversation between you and God. Right? That we should be with other people in such a way that when we leave them, they can pray. And again, this is where it often goes wrong. Like, it's possible to think about the terms you've given us here, Josh, about serving our neighbor. If that gets flattened down into something that's merely horizontal, it's just humans doing justice for other humans. God is just a metaphor for whatever my ideal of justice is. Then I'm not enabling them to pray. I'm making them dependent upon my act. I'm a liberator, right? And in whatever way I use violence to bring about that liberation, I'm ultimately creating a justice through my hands, the work of my hands. But I think Christian liberation, Luke 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, the recovery of sight to the blind, the opening of prison to those who are imprisoned. I mean, those aren't just metaphors. They're naming both things that he has done and is doing and things we are to do. But I think the heart of it is to be with people in such a way that we open their hearts toward God. That when we leave them, what we leave in our wake is them thanking God for something God is doing. Paul says this, right, to the Corinthians when he's writing them about giving. And he says that whole point about God loves a cheerful giver, and if you give much, you will receive much, and so on. And again, in my world, that was taken to be a kind of technique. Oh, if I sow $100 into Jason's ministry because he's anointed soil, I'm going to get $1,000 in return, right? But if you just read the text, what Paul says, your harvest is the praise of God in the lives of the people you gave to. So the harvest is not you get money back. The harvest is those people get to see God being faithful through your giving. That's what you reap. You reap their joy in God. I mean, at that point, if you can take joy in that, you've become like God. If you can't take joy in that, you haven't died yet. Back to a conversation, where Tony started us. If I don't find joy in you thanking God for what I've done,
You need to be transfigured.
I'm not yet transfigured, right? And so I think, yes, to serving our neighbor, but that's not just doing good deeds. That's not just, doing justice. It's doing it in such a way that the vertical is opened up. And the vertical and horizontal are seem to be one, as they are in the cross. Does that answer, Josh, what you're after there?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, because that kind of transactionalism is true across traditions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's yeah.
Well, I think, again, we're talking in broad strokes here, just as we're getting to know each other. But I think on my side of the tracks, the kind of old school, sweaty Pentecostal folks, were everything was vertical. They didn't care about the horizontal at all. Like, this world is going to be consumed in a year or two anyway. I mean, I grew up in a church. I thought the rapture was going to happen every day. I woke up expecting that day to be the last. Like, believe it or not.
You looked busy.
What's that?
You looked busy. No wonder you know so much.
Listen, one of my first dreams, I have to tell you guys this, like one of my first nightmares, I'm probably 5 years old. I mean, while I'm dreaming it, and I'm dreaming about myself in church, and I'm seated between my parents, just as I was 4 times a week, every week, for the whole service. We didn't have children's ministry. And I'm wearing a cowboy shirt, which means pearl snaps, and it's like really glittery.
They're popular in DC now among hipsters. Yeah.
Okay, well, this was pre-hipster. Like, this was just old school Oklahoma cowboy gear. And in the dream, I have, by the way, my son refers to this as my leash, which I love. Earlier, he's like, "Dad, your leash is loose." I was like, yes, it is, son.
I was
But
going to
anyway,
say, you've
it's
got that really wide as the Jordan Anglican thing going on.
The love
there,
of
brother.
God is wide, brother. So in the dream, I've got this cowboy shirt on, and I'm really proud of it. And the top button is unbuttoned, and the first pearl snap is unbuttoned. And suddenly, in the dream, 2 angels appear at the front of the church and start sorting people into 2 groups. And I know in the dream, they're sorting people into who's going in the rapture and who's going to be left behind for the judgment of God to fall on them. And I realize, if I don't get this pearl snapped before they get to my pew, I might not go in the rapture. And I wake up screaming. My grandmother runs into the room, like she thinks, I've broken something. And I just have had this nightmare. And I mean, that's just an example. I could tell you lots of stories like that about that's the world I grew up in. Like, but everything was vertical. There was no sense of responsibility to any neighbor. Like, we sang songs about, it's me and Jesus. Like, literally, we sang, it's me and Jesus. We got our own thing going. Like, we really believe that. But then I think, of course, that's a distortion. That's not the cross. That's a beam of the cross, but that's not the cross. That's idolatry. That's superstition. I think what it sounds like, from, of course, the little bit that I've moved in those circles and the friends I have, and Jensen would also often say this about his own experience, is that it's possible to have something that's entirely horizontal, right? In which Christianity is just reduced to, you got to do nice things for people who are suffering badly, or you got to do things to resist the people who are oppressing. And that's just as much a distortion. And that's not Jesus either. I think obviously what we need is to see the living God embodied in the mutilated body of the man on the cross, strung out between heaven and earth, between 2 thieves. And that's the only way to hear the gospel.
So here in our last minutes.
Don't say that to me. My fear of the
You mean
rapture.
before the rapture, Jim?
In our last moments here, I've lived all. I'm just now starting to calm down.
Let me get this button here.
So Asia says, I'm a former SEU student of Chris's, so this is perhaps more of a question for pastors and pastors in training. I was struck by Chris's description of the sermon moment as Eucharistic in nature. He describes it as something that causes longing in us to come to the table and eat. This idea seems to be described in more detail, that the proclamation of truth, only done in love, comes after listening, bearing, and helping. As someone in a younger generation and someone that has left charismatic circles because of the cult of personality, celebrity pastor scene that sometimes takes hold in those places, is there room for creativity in the moment of proclamation? Does it need to be sermonic, or can it be discussion, dialogue? Obviously, this would require a change of the entire Sunday morning creation, but is there a room for this moment to be an exchange rather than a deliverance? As the Eucharist is participatory, shouldn't the proclamation reflect this?
Thank you, Asia. It's great to hear from you. And I don't, yes, sort of, right? And I don't know, I mean, we should definitely have this conversation, continue this conversation after this. But I think I'm a firm believer in Christ is speaking both at the table and in the sermon, right? That Jesus is present. This is how he has chosen to be present. He's present in the way we need him to be. And I do think in the Eucharist, the way that we participate is by eating and drinking with thanksgiving, eating and drinking with our hearts at peace. The way that we participate in the sermon is by hearing. And we're back to where we began the conversation tonight. It's not that I'm opposed to having room for dialogue. It's that I think the most important thing is to realize the greatest gift is hearing. But back to the Transfiguration story. So, of course, we've talked a lot tonight. The Father says, listen to him. This is my son, the beloved, listen to him. Which, by the way, is word and table. Right? They see him, they hear that they're to listen to him. And you've got body and voice. That's what we're receiving every Sunday. Body and voice. This is my body, and this is the word of the Lord. So I think it's important, though, to realize that right before the cloud descends and the voice speaks, Peter, James, and John see Jesus talking with, or actually they see Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. This is stunning to me. Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus. Not they're listening to him. They're in conversation. Peter, James, and John are listening. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah are talking to each other. And in Luke's gospel, he says that Luke tells us that they are talking about his upcoming Exodus. Right now, I think this is the pinnacle moment of Jesus' life. I think it's the most mystical moment in Scripture and in Christian liturgy and in human history. Right. And what we're seeing in this moment actually is the reality that we've already read about elsewhere. When we read about Moses being hidden and God passing by, when we read about Elijah in the cave with his face covered and God drawing near in the still small voice, those moments are happening here. But those moments didn't happen way back there. This is the unfolding of that moment eternally. And Jesus is listening to Moses and Elijah as well as speaking to them. It's a conversation. Right? So I absolutely believe God means for us to dialogue. I mean, where we started tonight is I think he wants us to stand on our feet, face him, and talk. He wants us to, as Jensen will say, God speaks to us and invites us to speak up in the conversation, right? So I fully believe that. But all of that turns on the grace of listening, that Jesus listens to Moses and Elijah and they listen to him. And then Peter, James, and John learn to listen. So I think we have to recognize that in the sermon, the congregation being able to hear is not a passive state. Like in the what Asia's describing, and she's right. I mean, there are lots of circles, lots of charismatic Pentecostal circles in which you do have a kind of performance and audience watching the performance. But that's not a sermon. But that's not Jesus talking. That's somebody putting on a performance that other people are watching. Mm-hmm. But if it's a sermon, the audience's hearing is every bit as brooded over by the Spirit as that man or woman speaking is. And he or she speaks as Christ addressing his friends, his bride. And so I think the reason that I'm a little bit hesitant to just say yes is that I don't think we need a classroom. I don't think we need a place where you and I are sharing our ideas. Like, there is a room for that, but I don't think that's what the sermon is. The sermon is sacramental. It's Jesus talking with us, Jesus giving his body to us. And we need the grace of hearing there. So I don't want to make the sermon me sharing my ideas. Right? If it is what the church has proclaimed it to be, the sermon is Jesus speaking. And if that's what's happening, then the grace I want in that moment is to hear. God, let me hear. And even if I'm the one speaking, let me hear. Right. So I think we need to work through some of that before we alter what the sermon is. I mean, Scott Cairns, Orthodox poet, if you don't know him, I hope all of you will read him. He's tremendous. But he has this wonderful essay about the Jesus prayer, in which he talks about when he first became Orthodox, he thought he could improve the Jesus prayer because he's a poet.
So say what the Jesus prayer is.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a traditional Orthodox, it's a breath prayer where you say one sentence, right? Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, a sinner. And there are various slight variations of that, but it's essentially, Jesus, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner. And Cairns talked about recognizing that the power of this prayer was that the repentance it made possible was a repentance that was not possible in his own voice, with his own words. And what he's naming there, I think, is the ways in which, in a culture like ours, we think the most important thing is to be heard. Think about the ways we frame justice issues. People who have no voice are the ones who are oppressed. And again, I'm not dismissing that. I mean, there are people who have no voice. They need to be heard. But we're missing the other side of that. The fact that there are people who have no voice is a sign we're not listening. And that's the failure. The failure is a failure of hearing, primarily, fundamentally. Last thing I'll say about it, Rowan Williams has a terrific lecture on the Bible and communion, that the preaching of Scripture and the reading of Scripture is at home at the table, not in a devotional closet. And he makes this point that hearing is primary, right? So liturgically in our churches, we say, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We're in the posture, first and foremost, we're in the posture of hearing. And only when we have that posture can we speak. So thank you, Asia, for that question. We'll talk more about it.
So maybe just to wrap up, we have a number of questions here. I've asked Josh to screenshot them, so we will get to them. Bill Garner would like Chris maybe close out by, can you give an example of what it means to place your highest impulses, aspirations, gifts on the altar?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are lots of course, biblical examples, but I think all of the saints, without exception, this is their story, right? Where they have that they think that they want, right? That they desire, and it's something that has to die in order to be resurrected. And a personal example, maybe to kind of draw the point home. When I was 5 years old, right around the same time I had that dream about the cowboy shirt and the angels, the rapture, I told my mother, I'm going to be a preacher. I'm going to be a preacher. I knew that, and I think that was a move of God in my life. But of course, as I got older, became a teenager and a young man, I had all kinds of ideas about what that meant, what that would mean for me. Like the ways in which me doing that would yield this kind of response from people, would have this kind of effect, right? And of course, that's just not how it's turned out at all. Thank God, right? The ways in which what I would want for myself, what comes into my heart when I think about my future, is always less than what God intends. Always. Whatever I have ambition for, it's too small. Right? I mean, to go back for just a moment to Asia's question, the problem about a personality cult is not that someone is given too much attention or someone is given too high a place and other people are not. It's that none of that is real. Like nobody's actually being seen there, especially the person who's getting all the attention. The tragedy in a personality cult is that there's no person there. It's the personality that's getting the attention, not the person. And what God cares about is you and me personally. He doesn't care about personalities. He doesn't even see them. And so I think like recognizing that I am imagining a personality. When I think of myself and I think of my future, I can only see the personality that I can imagine for myself. God sees me. And living open-handedly with my future. I just preached about this a couple weeks ago. Father Arupe was the head of the Jesuit order. He has this incredible story. He was actually a priest in Nagasaki when the bomb went off and was one of the first responders, offered Eucharist that day in the midst of the victims and the fallout. And eventually later in life, at the Second Vatican Council, he's named the head of the Jesuits. I'm pretty sure that's when he's named. And then he has a long career. And at the end of his life, he starts to come into conflict with the Pope, John Paul II. Political stuff, right? And I'm not Roman Catholic, so I have no idea what was really at stake. I just know that there was a conflict. And he ends up having a stroke and really quickly starts debilitating. And then John Paul essentially passes over him and intervenes in a way that popes hadn't done in a long time in the order of the society. And right in the midst of all that, he's losing his speech, he's losing bodily function. And he writes this little word that is shared at the congregation where they're going to name his replacement. And he says, now, meaning with everything the Pope has done, with everything the stroke has done to my body, now I feel myself completely in the hands of God. And this is what I've wanted all of my life. Right? I mean, it isn't what he wants for himself, right? He's had a stroke and he's been humiliated publicly. He's been smacked down by his superior. But what he's enacting is this life of the cross, right? Like I want to share in Jesus' sufferings. And this is a hard place to know how to end, Jason, a hard place to know how to wrap up, because I don't think there's anything about Christianity, genuine Christianity, that has anything sadomasochistic in it at all. Like, I don't think there's any part of it that's about God wanting us to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe there's no way to live the life of God in our world without suffering.
Yeah.
Because even though God does not want us to suffer, God is drawn to those who are suffering. And the more like God we become, the more we're going to find ourselves there. And that's going to mean life as we know it is going to get turned upside down. Like, it's not going to be at all what we're expecting. Thankfully, because it's better. What God intends is better.
Yeah, no, that's Bonhoeffer, that's Herwas. Like, yeah, the Beatitudes are not aspiration. They're just a description of the people gathered around Jesus.
Yes, absolutely. And again, part of what I don't know if this is coming through or not. It's hard to tell in Zoom, right? But what I would want people to feel is you're not going to get the life you want for yourself, because what God has for you is better. So just let what you want die. the sooner the later, rather than later, because what God has for you is better.
Yeah.
It
Well,
is better.
yeah. I mean, we could do this all night, but like, yeah, that's Jensen, right? That like the God who gives you what you want, like that is idolatry. That's, yeah.
And it's impoverishing, right? I mean, if we could find an idol that always delivered what we want, our lives would get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. What opens us up is the God who gives us what we need. And man, just trust that. God is good. Like God is good, and it's absolutely worth trusting.
Yeah. Hell is God giving what you want. So Chris, so Josh began us with music. Will you benedict us out?
I'd like, if you don't mind, I'd like Father Ken to do it.
Tag in.
If you don't mind, I want to have Father Kenneth do it.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Chris. Well, Christ our God, we are so grateful that the uncreated light shines from you, not to show us the shape or the color or the size of something, but its beauty and its goodness and its truth. Thank you also for showing us that light shines in us, and every human, out from every human, and help us to see your light, that you are the one that enlightens everyone. Still us in that understanding, cause us to pay attention, to be still, to listen, so that we can see. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks again. Thanks, Chris. Thanks to all of you. I know there were questions. We will reserve those for next time. And Chris, yeah, thank you for the book. Thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And Chris, when I said we were going to do this, I should have made it clear. Like, if you can't make one of these Mondays, like we're all,
Well, I'm thinking that Joshua started with a song. Father Paul, who's my rector, he said, "Do you think he's singing to you? Like, is this a subtle note that maybe you should just not say anything at all?" So you say it best when you say nothing at all. No,
Absolutely not.
No, I know, man. It's fun. But yeah, I love these conversations. It's great to meet new folks too, and see Todd. I haven't seen. I mean, it's been years and years, man. But it's good to see you again.
It's been a long time. Good to see
Tony,
you.
send me the links to your commentaries. I'm going to put my PhD student on the Acts one.
Yeah, Tony writes good stuff. Yeah. And if anybody like out there is like a Robert Jensen nerd and wants Chris to send them something without having to pay the $40 journal article fee, Chris is a good dealer.
Yeah. Again, that I've got, right? If you need stuff on Jensen, I got that. Thanks for doing this, Jason. Really, seriously, man.
Oh no, man. Like, yeah, you're doing good stuff. So we're all grateful.
Yes.
All right, I'll
So
see
we'll
you
see
guys
y'all next.
Is it going to be the same crew each time? What's the plan?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Good. I look forward to it then.
Yeah.
I'll see you guys soon. All right. Thank
Yep.
you for that.
Thanks.
Peace out.
Peace out.